Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in our Talks with Walt, as we are calling our readings through the deathbed edition of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. We turn now to what some will argue is the greatest poem of Leaves of Grass, When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloom. We're going to look at this poem, obviously the first of the four poems of Memories of President Lincoln. We're going to look now at the first four sections, or the first cycle, as some scholars have referred to this poem. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Talks with Walt. Everything from the very beginning with inscriptions. We're going to reference several times, starting from Pomanak, one of the poems from inscriptions. We've given a set of introductory comments to both intro comments to Memories of President Lincoln, as well as intro comments to this very poem, Lilacs. Our background information is to remind ourselves that, first of all, and you can make this point, that the first four sections of this poem, of 16, is going to introduce us to the setting itself. Now, we're going to also be introduced to the key symbols of this poem, so let's go ahead and review them quickly, just so that we're set up for them. We're going to meet the star, of course, Venus here, which can represent several things. It can represent Lincoln, and obviously can represent as well the grief of Whitman. We're going to obviously be introduced to the symbolism of the lilac, the fact that it will happen in the spring. You'll remember, of course, it was Good Friday when Lincoln was shot. We'll have more to say about that. Obviously, lilacs can represent resurrection of a kind. The heart-shaped leaves can represent love. Obviously, the color of purple can represent the passion of Christ and the crucifixion, as well as, of course, the very violent death that Lincoln will have experienced. We're going to meet the hermit thrush, the bird, the reconciliation with death that this will be symbolizing, as well as the song that will take us to the soul's voice and the voice of the poet himself. Obviously, we're going to be thinking about spring as reoccurrence and the cycle of life and death and rebirth. Now, let's work section by section, beginning with section 1. And I just want to point out that when we begin with the word when, we right away are in interesting poetic territory, right? For example, just to give two examples, and I think that there's quite a bit of Chaucer standing behind lilacs. The very first word, of course, the Canterbury Tales opening lines of the general prologue, when in April the sweet showers fall. Well, obviously we are in April. You'll also remember that Keats wrote a really important poem, When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be Before My Pen Has Gleaned My Teeming Brain. So the fact that he begins with the word when shouldn't go absent on us. When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, and the great star early drooped in the western sky in the night, I mourned and yet shall mourn with ever-returning spring. Ever-returning spring, Trinity sure to me you bring. Lilac blooming perennial and drooping star in the west, and thought of him I love. Now, notice right away, the use of the word lilac will happen for our first time in Song of Myself, passage 23. You can go back to look at how it's used there. Of course, the idea of the dooryard, it's a fascinating word, this idea of dooryard. And of course, the idea of doors, the opening, the kind of looking in on, this will be significant. And then obviously, because the title of all of these poems is in Leaves of Grass, the idea of blooming, and we've seen this kind of motif again and again already. We'll take ourselves right to the gray star again, to Venus, early drooped in the western sky in the night. This idea of drooping, we have already seen it in the wound dresser, my face drooped, and we're going to come back to it here, obviously, in a few lines. The western sky and the idea of being in the west. Now, this is significant, I think, in terms of not just east-west notions of the rotation of the earth, but the expansion of America from east to west. And of course, the consideration of Lincoln as being a product of the West, and all the things that Whitman has said up to this point about the West. Notice in the western sky, and then obviously in the night. So we're beginning with the idea of the changing and the loss of light, and why that's significant. He will say it in the third line, I mourned, and yet shall mourn with ever-returning spring. Now this is the only time that that phrase gets used, the two times back to back. Ever-returning spring. This idea that from here on out, he says it, my life is going to somehow be tainted, marked with this recognition that Lincoln's death in the spring will be something I will never forget. And of course, it was never forgotten in Whitman's life. This would be the spring of all springs. Notice he uses the word Trinity, which will take us to patrolling Barnegat 2 times. The only other use of Trinity will happen right here, right? Trinity, sure to me you bring. Now, what's compelling about the use of the word Trinity? Obviously, it takes us back to our study of St. Augustine's Confessions. We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net. But the idea that we've got these 3 symbols, this trinity of symbols that will happen, of course, the idea of Trinity as well takes us very much in Christian theology to the sacred. And I think that's where Whitman is wanting us to go. Lilac blooming, we're back to the very first line in the last word. Blooming perennial will suggest this is an ongoing struggle. And drooping star in the west, notice the repetition of these ideas. And thought of him I love. 5 times in this poem, him I love will be utilized. And we're going to get to this I love again in the 3rd stanza here in a bit. Now in the 2nd stanza, from mourned, we will actually begin the mourning process. And there will then be a clear elegy here with the repetition of O. Now we have seen this again and again in our study of Leaves of Grass. Of course, that final section of Paumanok comes to mind. 8 times now we're going to get O. 4 times we're going to get exclamation points. O powerful western fallen star. O shades of night. O moody, tearful night. O great star disappeared. O the black murk that hides the star. O cruel hands that hold me powerless. O helpless soul of me. O harsh surrounding cloud that will not free my soul. Now obviously the internal rhythms and rhyming of me and free will want to pay attention. And the brilliance of this language, of the language of longing, the language of lamentation, the lugubrious language, can I use that phrase? The lugubrious language. In other words, right away, Whitman wants to say, I cannot find words to describe the utter sorrow that I feel. Notice we'll begin with powerful western falling star. This western again taking us back. The use of the word powerful will come back to this word again and again. It's provocative. The shades of night, moody, tearful night. Obviously, we're back to the use. We're back to this notion of moody. We'll use it only 1 time in all of Leaves of Grass, and it's going to be right here. In other words, really sad, moody, tearful night. Oh, great star disappeared. So now we're back already to the idea of the star disappeared. Oh, the black murk. I told you guys in our study of drum taps the significance of the use of coloration. Here, of course, the use of the word black. Black murk. This will take us back to Broadway Pageant 2, if you want to go back and see how he uses the word murk there. That hides the star. Oh, cruel hands. You'll maybe remember cruel from Ethiopia saluting the colors. It's the only other use of the word cruel in all of Leaves of Grass. Hands that hold me powerless. Notice from powerful to powerless, right? Oh, helpless soul of me. Oh, harsh surrounding cloud. So from black murk now to cloud. That will not free my soul. In other words, all of the imagery of the swamp that we will come to is now for the first time gestured towards. And there is such a provocative history of this kind of language. I mean, I mentioned Augustine and St. Augustine's Confessions, and then, of course, back to that tragic loss of his closest and dear friend from passage 6 to 8, where there's the idea that just everything is just becoming impossible with the idea of the covering that will just send us to this moment of we got no language for what we're feeling. And here the poet is obviously trying to give us language of something which is probably translinguistic, a great pain. It's always been this way. By the way, this will as well take us back to our study of Keats' Nightingale. We've given full lecture on it as well, if you want to run that one to ground. Now in passage 3, we're ready to set more of the setting. In the dooryard, Fronting an old farmhouse near the whitewashed paling stands the lilac bush, tall growing with heart-shaped leaves of rich green, with many a pointed blossom rising, delicate with the perfume strong I love, with every leaf a miracle, and from this bush in the dooryard, with delicate colored blossoms and heart-shaped leaves of rich green, a sprig with its flower I break. Now, the introduction to the third line of the poem with I mourned will be returned to once again with the pronoun I, but it will take a while for us to get to Whitman or to the speaker poet of the poem. Notice we'll start first of all with prepositions again, and we pointed out how Whitman is the king of how to use prepositions. If you want to be a great writer, a great poet, study this type of thing. Notice we're in the dooryard fronting an old farmhouse. This farmhouse will be used from Song of Myself 33 if you want to go back and run into ground. Near the whitewashed palings, notice we go from black murk to whitewashed. And so this juxtaposition of coloration, again, you can go and find this in any number of other great writers. I think Conrad's Heart of Darkness plays the game about as well as anybody. This juxtaposition of different coloration. Notice the palings and the idea of pale and the idea that it's something that's almost like unhealthy pale. Stands the lilac bush. Notice the lilac bush is pictured as tall growing, heart-shaped leaves. By the way, this heart-shaped will be used 3 times here, twice, and then in passage 16 of this poem. Heart-shaped leaves of rich green. Now we're back to a different color, and of course the green, the color of hope, maybe we would say. With many a pointed blossom rising. Delicate, we're going to get to this delicate again. It will take us back to Song of Myself 24 when he uses this word for the first time. With the perfume strong I love, that idea of the senses, he's eliciting all the senses. Now it's what can I smell? Strong I love takes us back to, of course, of him I love. With every leaf, a miracle. Now he's concentrating on the lilac bush, and this will take us with the word miracle to starting from Paumanok 12, where all, he says it this way, all the things of the universe are perfect miracles. So I love that he uses this word miracle again. It's a compelling use of the word, given that this will be an elegy where he's going to present the true tragedy of the loss of Lincoln for him. With every leaf, a miracle, and then the use of the dash. We've seen it in passage 2 already of this poem. Of course, we're very familiar with his use of the dash. It makes us think of Emily Dickinson, who would, of course, herself write a number of poems dealing with the very topic of death, and we'll want to compare them, obviously, in 3a. And from this bush in the dooryard, with delicate colored blossoms and heart-shaped leaves of rich green, the syntax is interesting. A sprig, it'll be used 3 times only, and only in Leaves of Grass, the 3 times in this poem. A sprig with its flower I break. Now, of course, if Leaves of Grass is going to be the title of our collection, then obviously the use of the word flower here will make us sit up and take note. The use of the word break, I think, is central. The snapping off. I mean, obviously it's part of what you can hear, so we're playing with all, again, of the major senses. But the idea of breaking, in other words, a rupture, can we say it that way? Whitman wants to point out that there is, in this black murk, there is a rupture that he is going to be lamenting. Something will be broken. Notice the significance of that idea, given his insistence on, again, his sustained theodicy, that so much about the war was bringing together unity, and now everything is going to be broken in some way. Speaking of swamp, now we'll go to the last part of the setting in passage 4, and we're back again to more prepositions. In the swamp, in secluded recesses, a shy and hidden bird is warbling a song, solitary the thrush. The hermit, withdrawn to himself, avoiding the settlements, sings by himself a song. Song of the bleeding throat, death's outlet, song of life. For well, dear brother, I know, if thou wast not granted to sing, thou wouldst surely die. Now, let's point out, just to read from back to front, the last, for well I know, dear brother, for well, dear brother, I know, that's set off in parenthetics, which is so significant because, of course, the identification of the poet with the bird will take us to Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking. I said to you guys that we read Leaves of Grass to learn how to read Leaves of Grass, and everything that's come before has in some ways been preparatory for lines like the ones that we're looking at. Notice, for example, we are in the swamp. Now, we've seen this before. Go back to the first opening lines of Song of Myself, and this idea of he's going to take a swim, and the idea of certain kind of watery area, swampy area, it will obviously be significant. Go back to everything that we said about sea drift to see some of this as well. The use of the word secluded and the use of the word recesses will allow us to read this poem, not just literal geography, but we could argue metaphysical geography, right? The inner secluded recesses. Notice that the bird is shy, the bird is hidden. Obviously, we're going to be speaking about a poet here in a few seconds as well as shy and hidden. And we've seen this before. In other words, Whitman kind of hiding maybe some of who and what he is. And then the use of the word warbling, which again will take us back to starting from Paumanok 10, warblings under the sun. Notice the use of song and the repetition of the word song obviously ties us to Song of Myself. Shy and a hidden bird is warbling a song. Then the use of solitary, we're familiar with this concept already in Leaves of Grass. The thrush, the hermit, withdrawn to himself. And again, of course, makes us immediately think of Out of the Cradle Endlessly Rocking. Avoiding the settlements, staying away from the others. Whitman identifying with the solitary nature of the bird. We've seen this before. Sings by himself, again, Song of Myself, a song. So this is brilliant, brilliant stuff. For this poem to be sitting where it sits in the dead heart, smack center in the heart of Leaves of Grass, to be echoing all of those earlier kinds of resonances. And as I said to you guys, I really believe that T.S. Eliot learned this power of the echo, and he mentions it, of course, in Bert Norton, my words echo thus in your mind, but to what purpose? Disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves, I do not know. Other echoes inhabit the garden, shall we follow? Quick, said the bird, find them, found them, round the corner through the first gate, into our first world. Shall we follow the deception of the thrush into our first world? That set of lines at the very beginning of 4 quartets, and we've given full lectures at learnstrong.net on that, all those lines. I think so much of 4 quartets is born of these very lines right here. Notice Song of the Bleeding Throat. This is the only use of bleeding throat. I like to think of the great short story that we love in 303, The Scarlet Ibis, James Hurst's really important short story from 1960. You can run that one to ground. I certainly recommend that you read that story after you've studied this poem to see how this poem influenced so much of what Hurst is doing. Song of the Bleeding Throat, Death's Outlet. By the way, of course, the use of bleeding takes us back to drum taps, no question. Death's Outlet, Song of Life. What an amazing line. I mean, just take a walk and just think about what that line, what those words mean to you. Death's outlet, Song of Life. That is to say, from death, there is always some kind of new life. And that takes us back, of course, to Song of Myself, passage 6, which I don't think you can read Lilacs without going back and studying closely what we had to say about Song of Myself 6. Then in parenthetics, for well, and then the use of dear brother, that's significant, right? I know, again, taking us back to that epistemological, one of our big 5, that idea, what is it that I know? I know if thou wast not granted. Now he's talking to the bird, but of course he could be talking to himself. If thou was not granted to sing, thou wouldst surely die. This surely die, by the way, is language that will resonate for Whitman's readers as Christian language as well. This notion that if you're not allowed to sing, then you surely will die is powerful, powerful idea for a poet that is writing the elegy. How could this have happened? Well, now to finish it 2a, I think sometimes the point here is that the only response to pain is to, in fact, sing. It's the only way to deal with the murky nature of it all. At 2b, I think the repetition of "oh" 8 times in this opening passage is powerful, as in a song, a lamentation. Lugubrious was our word. At 3a, I mentioned Hurst and Scarlet Ibis. I've mentioned Chaucer and the opening lines of Canterbury Tales, but I want to take us to Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. We've given a full lecture on it at learnstrong.net if you want to run that to ground. And I think that there's some significant readings to compare with the two. The idea of moving into the darkness of the early evening and the way in which death then has to be reconciled and accorded some respect. Finally, at 3B, how are we going to own a set of opening lines like this? Well, I think we could ask a couple of interesting questions. One is, what was a time in your life when you were so sad, but all you could really do to deal with that sadness was to sing? And when was a time that you understood that death and loss could only be experienced in a solitary way? Come back next and we'll work with cycle number 2 in sections 5 through 9 as we get into this amazing poem. Thank you.